of people find frustrating about reading the Hebrew Bible is how repetitive it is. It's repetitive on purpose for actually a really interesting reason. So when the Hebrew Bible was kind of consolidated and put together into books, especially the books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible in particular, there were a number of different sources that had written these different histories of the Hebrew people. Remember that the first 5 books are called the books of Moses, and these are the books that establish the Hebrew people. These are their core stories. This is like their core identity, telling the story of where they came from and who they are and who their God is. And there were a number of different sources, and if you go into source criticism, which is a form of biblical criticism, you'll see that they identify 4 different sources, 4 different kind of author groups for the Hebrew Bible, and especially the Torah, the first 5 books. And what they find is, instead of taking multiple different sources and harmonizing them, or like sifting them out and including a little bit here and a little bit there and weaving it into a cohesive narrative, the people who consolidated the canon seemed to just take everything and put it together. And so they'd tell the story here, and then they'd tell the exact same story again right after it. You'll notice this clearly when you look at, for instance, the book of Genesis, and you see that humans were created in Genesis chapter 1, and then in Genesis chapter 2, they're created all over again, right? 2 different stories, 2 different ways of telling the relationship between God, God's creation, and humanity. But instead of choosing one, they just decided, well, let's keep them both. Let's see how this edifies the people, to have to think about this from multiple different perspectives, and to challenge our belief that there's one right way to tell a story, or one right takeaway from an event or an experience. My understanding of the book of Numbers is that it has a particular point that it's trying to make, which is God has a vision for a covenantal community. And this story of the wilderness is really one of the 2 foundational stories of the Hebrew people, right? If we were to really think about what are the identity stories of the Israelites, it's really the Exodus out of Egypt into the Promised Land, and then the experience of exile after their nation is conquered by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and the return. The Exodus and the exile are the 2 kind of core stories to Hebrew identity. And then after that, then you move into the rabbinical period, and this period of the people in the diaspora, the dispersion after the destruction of Jerusalem, and how do we maintain our identity as Jewish people when we don't have the tabernacle, when we don't have the temple, when we don't have this one particular place where God is so close to us. How do we keep God close to us? And so the wilderness is a really critical story for us to understand, because it informs so much of not only Hebrew thinking, but also really Christian theology as well. This was an important story for Jesus, this experience of wilderness, right? We get an echo of this when we notice that Jesus went away to the wilderness, to a mountain by himself, right after he's baptized. For how long? 40 days. Not an arbitrary amount of time. Not only were the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years, but Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days before he received the law, before he received the tablets. We think about the cloud hovering over the tabernacle, and then we think about last week we celebrated the Transfiguration, where the cloud, the majesty of God, came down and rested upon Jesus with his disciples present, or at least a few of them. This story is really critical for us. And the other thing that's really critical about the story and about the book of Numbers, what it wants to communicate is it really wants to communicate this tension between the faithfulness of God and the frequent faithlessness of the people. That God is still and always God. God shows up for God's people, God cares for God's people, but God will allow God's people to do what they want. And if they want to walk away, they're welcome to do so. Now there's consequences. There's always consequences for every behavior, for every action. There's an equal and opposite reaction. But God is going to be God regardless. And this is what covenant means. When we think about the word covenant, we usually only hear it in a couple of particular places. We usually only hear it in places like a wedding, for example. We also actually hear it when we join as members of a church. We are a covenantal community. And a covenant is different from a contract, and if you've ever been at a wedding that I've officiated, you've heard me say this before. But a contract is an agreement based on mutual distrust, right? I'm going to provide a service, and you're going to give me money, and I don't trust you to do that at all. So let's make sure we write this down so that when I take you to small claims court, I can tell them exactly what you did wrong. Contract, right? How many of you ever gotten into business with somebody and you didn't make a contract, and you learned why you needed to make one? Does that just me? No? Okay. A few of you, right? You never will make that mistake again. When you don't trust the person, it's better to have it in writing, right? A covenant is a completely different thing. A covenant is basically a commitment. I think of it like it's an identity statement that's expressed in behavior. This is how I'm going to act because it's who I am. And this is how I'm going to act regardless of how you treat me. This is how I think about forgiveness. I don't offer forgiveness because the other person deserves it necessarily. I offer it because I'm not going to let their behavior change who and how I am in the world. And if you've been horrible to me, I'm not going to let that make me bitter and mean and callous and defensive. I'm going to forgive you, not because you're doing right and good, but because I don't want to hold on to that anymore. I'm going to be me regardless of how you treat me. A covenant is an identity statement expressed in behavior. And God is a covenantal God, and that's one of the things that's revealed throughout Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is this God who continues to be God to the people of Israel. Now, we can certainly pick elements of this story where God seems less generous and gracious and forgiving than we often think about God. And we can get into that if you want, but I feel like that's a distraction from the point. Because God is still God when the people are terrible, disrespectful, ungrateful, distracted, idolatrous, ridiculous, whiny, complaining. And anybody who's ever been in a committed relationship knows that covenant only really matters when stuff gets hard, right? How I'm going to be is easy when we're in agreement, right? When things are easy and they're not rocky and there's no challenges and there's no money involved, right? It's easy to be in covenant when there's no real decisions to be made. But the second you got to sort out childcare, household chores, management of finances, all of a sudden, like, covenant gets real. I was just talking to somebody the other day, and he said, man, I had no idea how hard it was going to be to stay married. It wasn't hard to get married, but staying married was a real challenge. Yeah. Because covenant is hard, because we have to decide who we're going to be regardless of the other person, and maybe we didn't know the other person all that well until we started finding out. You're like, ooh, that's not what I thought was going on. Now I have to decide who and how am I going to be when I find this out? Who and how am I going to be when this truth is revealed to me? I was working with another couple. I was doing their premarital counseling. Turned out one of them had been hiding a meth addiction for all of their relationship. They had been dating for 4 years. They got engaged, and he freaked out. And she was like, something's wrong. This is the happy time. We need to talk. Slowly but surely it comes out. He's been addicted and hiding his meth addiction their entire relationship since before they got together, which is insane, right? And so think about all the things that she had to go through, realizing, like, I had no idea somebody could hide something this profound from me. Somebody that I live with could hide this from me, and I could have no idea. How do I stay in relationship with you? How do we build trust back? They have a kid now. There's no way that they were going to have a kid until they worked this through. And it's never worked out. It's never done. But I think that covenant is the thing that allows one to keep showing up regardless of the other person. Now, these people are absolutely amazing humans. If you ever get the chance to meet them, they're just phenomenal And sometimes it doesn't work because sometimes the people that we're in covenant with aren't willing to be in covenant with us. They're not willing to continue to show up as the person that they're claiming to be. Sometimes the covenant is broken. We talk about this when we counsel around domestic violence and relationships. The covenant was broken the second the violence happened in that relationship. It's not that the person who's being victimized in that relationship is breaking the covenant by exiting the marriage. The covenant was already broken because this is how we were going to treat each other and we didn't. Just want to say that as a caveat because sometimes it gets confusing. I just need to make sure that I name that. But the important thing here is that it's not, our covenant, our commitment to each other cannot just be defined by how it feels, right? Because if we're going to stay in relationship with people, it's going to get hard. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be frustrating. People are going to disappoint us. I'm going to disappoint you. Do you all know that? Yeah? Some of you know that better than others of you. Right? But like that's just how it's going to be. And so how we feel in the moment can't be the thing that guides us to stay in relationship, to stay in covenant. Now, the people of Israel have this pillar of fire that is making it obvious to them that God is with them. And when the cloud rests on the tabernacle, what are they supposed to do? Sit down. And when the cloud moves, what are they supposed to do? Get up. Really easy, right? As long as you're just noticing this incredible divine presence, then you know what to do. How many of you get a good pillar of fire more often than not? I would like occasionally get a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, but like the thing that's going to ground us, that's going to orient us, that's going to remind us how to stay in covenant, it's not going to be that. Covenant is an identity that is expressed in behavior. And I believe that church is a covenantal community. Because when we join a church, we commit not necessarily like to the church or even to the faith, but to our development together. One of the things I've been realizing a lot lately is if we want to really think critically about the church in the world, we have to differentiate three concepts. We have to separate the church from the religion, and we have to separate both of those from the faith. Now, I told my brother this, and he was like, what does any of that mean?
Exactly, coming in.
All right, so here we go. Your faith, right? In the Greek, the word is not believe, intellectual assent. What is it? Trust, right? What do you trust in? What's the thing that's true regardless of how everything looks? Is love stronger than hate? Is forgiveness a worthy path rather than punishment or redemptive violence? Is there real freedom in the world? Is everyone made in the image of God? These are not things that can be proven, and sometimes they can be the opposite of proven, right? They can be disproven. People can give you evidence and information that shows you that actually that guy's kind of a piece of garbage, and that actually this doesn't really work out, and actually we should have guns in order to be safe, and actually, right? You hear where I'm going from? But what we have faith in, what we trust in, is the thing that guides us, that's true for us regardless of the circumstances. That's like the covenant that we have with our understanding of God. This is who God is, this is how the world is, and this is how I'm going to live in the world. That's what our faith is. Now, religion is a set of practices and ideas and concepts, behaviors, beliefs, structures, institutions that have tried and succeeded, but also failed to help people grow in their faith. That's the stuff, the legacy that's passed down to us to help form our faith. Now, everybody's got a faith, whether they know it or not, whether they frame it out that way or not. But religion has been trying to shape the faith of people over time, right? So Augustine and Irenaeus and Thomas Aquinas, these are people in the religion that have had the goal of shaping the faith of individuals. Now, church is something separate than faith and something separate than religion. Because church is where we practice our faith and practice at religion in community. Church isn't faith and it isn't religion. It's a place where we figure those things out together in a community. And we're not experts at religion. We might not even be all that good at religion. And we might not all actually have that strong of a faith. And we might not all have the same faith. But the point is that we're working it out together. And that's what church is living into and living out of a faith informed by religion. But church is separate from those things. And I think one of the things that's going to help us in the world is to differentiate these three things and ask ourselves, what's our relationship to faith personally? What's our relationship to religion personally? What's our relationship to church personally? See, I think that church is a big part of our identity, and not to say that we are defined by our church, because our church is whatever, it's a group of people together, right? And so it's a complicated mess, beautiful, gorgeous, complicated mess. But the reason that church is part of our identity is it's because it's a place where we get to practice our identity. We get to hone our identity. We get to hone our faith. What does it look like to trust in this? What does it look like to be a covenantal person when I'm in relationship with people? When things get hard and people chafe and people say stuff that pisses me off, or people have a different idea about what we're supposed to be doing and what matters, what's important. It's like a crucible. It's a testing ground. It's a growth space. And so it becomes part of our identity because it's a place where we kind of learn or lean into or experience our identity more fully. Because you can have all the faith in the world on your own, but then when you come into relationship with somebody, that's when you really know, just like covenant, that's when you really know whether you're committed or not. So if covenant is an identity expressed in behavior, then how covenantal are we? How covenantal is each one of us? How covenantal am I? What is my identity as expressed in my behavior? And how are we going to be guided? How are we going to gather as covenantal people? What is going to, if we're not going to have this pillar of fire, if we're not going to have this beautiful, very obvious presence of God, then what is going to guide us and gather us